They came in the dark, 180 drones buzzing, 120 tanks rumbling, 1,500 troops marching forward. Moscow counted on speed and firepower. Kyiv had something else in mind. Hours of night labor had turned farmland into fortress. Pits, spikes, concealed artillery, and motorcycle hunters weaving among wreckage. By 7:20 a.m., the battle flipped. Dozens of tanks destroyed, infiltration squads crushed, retreat cut off. The cost? Pennies compared to Russia's grand gamble. This isn't just a victory, it's a turning point, and you're about to see why NATO calls it a battlefield revolution. Before we move on, I will like you to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Why would Moscow throw 180 drones, 120 tanks, and 1,500 infantry into one single night strike? The gamble was bold and rooted in a basic calculation. Flood the field with machines, overwhelm defenders with speed, and carve a hole large enough to shatter resistance before sunrise. Russian planners envisioned a corridor opening through 3 Ukrainian cities in one sweep, where armor would roll forward under drone cover, while infantry poured in behind to exploit the breach. It wasn't just a military move, it was a gamble on psychology too, built to break morale by showing that numbers alone could decide the fight. The clock was their silent partner, with every minute of darkness meant to mask the columns, until the assault erupted in full force. But the math ignored one thing. Ukraine had not been idle. Beneath fields and roads that looked empty, engineers had already written a different script. The ground itself had been reshaped into a maze of lethal surprises. Mines were buried not in scattered clusters, but in patterned belts that overlapped and intersected like invisible walls. Anti-tank pits, deep and narrow, sat carved into supposed crossing routes. Metal spikes lay hidden under thin soil, ready to rip the treads off any vehicle unlucky enough to stray across them. What seemed like open farmland was actually a trap, painstakingly laid over weeks, designed not just to resist, but to mislead. By the time the first wave had rolled more than a kilometer past the frontier, the assault was already bleeding. Mines tore through tracks and hulls before a single Ukrainian soldier fired a weapon. 11 tanks sat crippled and burning in the open, their million-dollar armor shells scattered like disposable scrap. In those first moments alone, Russia lost not only momentum, but millions of dollars worth of gear. Ukraine's cost had been only the price of buried explosives and steel obstacles. The larger storm pressed on. Drone swarms zipped overhead, feeding coordinates and relaying images, even as armored columns slowed. Infantry squads moved off-road, creeping through ditches and tree lines, hoping to flank Ukrainian positions and bypass the maze. For a moment, it looked like a chance remained. If they struck from the side, perhaps the wall of defenses could be cracked. Knife-carrying units and demolition teams slipped in behind, braced to ignite strong points from close range. The vision of a breakthrough flickered again. That was the moment Ukraine struck its counter. Mortars opened and drones swooped low, hunting men instead of tanks. Lightweight quadcopters carried explosives into small ravines, finding squads that thought they were hidden. Thermal sights picked out movement in the brush, directing artillery fire with uncanny precision. The infiltration units, meant to tip the balance, were cut down before they could link up, leaving armored spearheads isolated and unsupported. What had been billed as a clean night push collapsed into broken formations, burning vehicles, and scattered men with no direction. In less than 2 hours, Russia's $750 million gamble was staggering under the weight of its own losses. What came next would flip the perception of power on the battlefield and challenge decades of military doctrine in one fiery demonstration. How did Ukraine dismantle Moscow's massive assault worth hundreds of millions with barely $20 million in tools? The answer begins with how a web of simple, low-cost systems blended into a synchronized defense. Ukraine didn't line up tanks nose to nose like past wars. Instead, it spread lethal flexibility across the battlefield. Motorcycle squads darted through orchards and ruined buildings, carrying anti-tank weapons strapped to their backs. Concealed artillery crouched silently in prepared positions, crews waiting for coordinates relayed through compact drones circling overhead. Each piece might look humble on its own, but together they formed a symphony that struck with precision where Russia was weakest. Russian columns, shaken by early losses, tried to collect themselves on nearby roads and fields. Commanders sought to restore order, reposition their armored wings, and get infantry out of the traps. Yet at every attempt to regroup, a different Ukrainian tool appeared. Oplot tanks lurked at choke points, hitting Russian armor when they paused. Bodana's self-propelled artillery shifted fire seamlessly, dropping shells into staging areas before convoys could reform. Drone operators, tracking movements from above, sent updates instantly, ensuring that no massing force lasted more than minutes before being scattered again across the terrain. The environment collapsed into chaos. Fires rolled through tree lines, black smoke curling over hills where tank engines once roared. Disabled vehicles clogged retreat lanes, turning narrow roads into burning graveyards where fresh reinforcements met barricades of their own destroyed comrades. Infantry who found temporary shelter inside shell craters discovered too late that those pits became cages once Ukrainian fire bracketed them. The illusion of momentum, so central to Moscow's plan, evaporated into disarray, where even communication between units splintered under the constant disruption. Command trucks, the backbone of coordination, were ripped apart by shells guided not by random fire, but by live drone feeds. The scale of control stunned outside observers. NATO analysts, reviewing intercepted footage and after-action reports, labeled it quietly as a doctrinal earthquake. The sight of mobile cheap drones guiding artillery and infantry ambushes to destroy formations worth hundreds of millions shook long-held assumptions about firepower. Decades of planning on sheer volume, overwhelming strikes, and mass armored thrusts faced a sharp counterexample. Integration and patience could dismantle brute numbers at a fraction of the cost. Losses accumulated at a rate impossible to ignore. More than 600 Russian troops were recorded killed or incapacitated. Vehicle losses climbed into the hundreds, many never even entering full combat before being abandoned or destroyed. Against this toll, Ukraine's expenditure amounted to mines planted weeks earlier, shells distributed in careful stockpiles, and drones bought for tens of thousands rather than millions each. The ledger showed imbalance. $750 million of equipment met $20 million of preparation, and the expensive gamble drowned under its own weight. On the ground, the numbers translated into moments far more human than spreadsheets could show. In one burned-out orchard, a Ukrainian soldier poured water into the cracked lips of a Russian teenager pulled from his scorched uniform. The contrast was stark. Moscow had pushed him forward as part of statistics, while his opponent met him as a person caught in a war he hadn't chosen. That image reflected the real divide. One side driven by abstract volume, the other by deliberate use of every tool, every resource, and every choice. The payoff came clear. Ukraine proved foresight and patience could substitute for mass. That shaping terrain and integrating technology stripped brute force of its advantage. This wasn't simply a win on one battlefield. It set a stage where future conflicts would no longer be judged strictly by who held more tanks or warplanes. In the ashes of this engagement, a new definition of power emerged, where smaller nations could stand against overwhelming aggression and still hold ground. And from that landscape, the lesson extended outward. Preparation and integration now outweigh sheer weapon count, and every leader watching took note. What broke Moscow's massive investment wasn't sheer weapon count, but disciplined preparation. Ukraine showed that foresight in shaping terrain, patience in waiting for the right strike, and tight control of resources can defeat an opponent many times larger. This battle didn't just shift a front line, it challenged how modern warfare itself is measured. Think about what that means for smaller nations facing overwhelming threats. Strength is no longer about who has the bigger arsenal, but who uses it smarter. What do you anticipate will happen further in this conflict? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below.